Good evening. Good evening. Thank you all very much for spending your Friday evening with us. Let me start at the end by thanking, first of all, Peter, and second of all, and maybe the tie for first of all, Wendy Hellman, who put all of this together and handled myriad logistical problems to get our British friends from wherever they were to Los Angeles, and they seem all to have survived, so thank you very much. Peter wants to make a few remarks, just briefly to provide a context for this discussion, which will then be unraveled probably relatively quickly. Last summer, when Peter was teaching here, we had a discussion, which is an ongoing discussion, which doesn't only belong to SCI-Arc. Not much, to be honest, belongs entirely to SCI-Arc now. A more generic discussion about the proposition of various media and software and issues of drawing and representation, which the argument runs is becoming a pro forma or a formula or a method or a system, a learned system and a repetitive system. But don't misunderstand, this was not an attack per se on the digital era or any other era, but I think really the operational principle was, in a certain sense, and maybe this applies to all teaching, that by the time you can teach it, it's too late, in a way. Because what we're looking for, and I think Peter's career points to this, is what we're looking for is something which is substantially more fragile or delicate or new or experimental, which isn't yet established to the point where I can say it and you can learn it, or I can say it and you can repeat it. And I think the proposition was that with the digital era, or the advent of the digital era, and the linguistics that belong to it, there was a consistency. It was already a genre. And then Peter pulled out of his back pocket, or front pocket, a recent catalog of work from Bartlett School, which you all know, which were very unusual examples of the drawing work, not to say performance, of the architects that are here tonight, which seem to be an argument to the contrary, which is to say there is an area of personality, of idiosyncrasy within the genre, which is moving it in a number of quite interesting directions. And we'll listen to that this evening. One other point, because there are many students here, CJ Lim, who is sitting to Peter's left, will be teaching here in the summer, be teaching the summer studio. So some of you may be interested in that. Captain Cook.
Dr. Thank you. I think that I put this slide up here. It's my slide for the evening, not my own work, as you might guess, but the work of an old, from the 20s to the 40s, English eccentric cartoonist called William Heath Robinson, who CJ happens to be a particular fan of as well. And I put it up because it's silly. And I think that's the clue, that there are two ways of, at least two ways, if not 93 ways of entering the conversation. One, I think, from Eric's perspective, is to see it as kind of a statement of alternative to correct procedures. And that somehow drawing, because it's very, it can be very wayward, and it can be very instantaneous. You know, even the computer, perhaps so far, is not able suddenly to change its mind. It tends to work best, I'm told, when it works through certain sort of consistencies, whereas you can have something on the end of the pen and maybe you shivered, or maybe the pencil broke, or maybe you just got bored with the line going in the same direction. And this waywardness and this silliness, I think, are, to me, intrinsically part of the endless line of drawing. Is it drawing even we're talking about? Because upstairs there are also some models. It's the fiddling around. And there are only three of us who are technically English on this platform. The rest come from here and there and found themselves hanging out for rather longer than usual in London. But nonetheless, they, I suppose, subscribe to certain traditions of perversity and low threshold of boredom. I think that we get bored very much more quickly than certain other cultures, and we fiddle about and we like asides. As I said in the catalogue notes, that there are parallels in the tradition of literature, theatre, detective novels, and hearsay, which is where, you know, anybody can invent a polemic and have a hero and a villain, but it's much more interesting to have somebody you're not quite sure whether they're hero, villain, or sideways. You're not quite sure where it's leading, and sometimes it doesn't lead anywhere, but you have a great time manoeuvring around. This is a silly cartoon which suggests that you could have sports without space, and involves occasionally in Heath Robinson's work things that come very, very close to invention. And I have tried it, not this evening, but you can try and put one of Cedric Price's famous diagrammatic propositions for how you might use the strategies and energies of a situation. Put it next to Heath Robinson, who does silly things with situations, and somehow between the two you get the sniff of a question of value systems, depiction, sequence, circumstances, organizations, which, without asking your permission, will jump from value to value to value to value to value and into nowhere. And that's sort of what I think this culture is about. The fact that even the progeny of the notion was then we have three tutors or sets of tutors, and then each of them has a nominee, their progeny. But even if you look at the exhibition and the catalogue, you'll see that the progeny are not particularly consistent with the teacher. In fact, you could do wonderful tricks to say, wait a minute, Johan, is he actually Lim's student, or it could of course be Mark's student on a wet Thursday? And that's lovely, that kind of thing is great, you know, because if it becomes predictable, it's boring. And I think that I want to throw into the ring almost immediately this question of two questions. One, do we mean drawing, or are we just using drawing as an excuse for being creatively perverse? But I mean creatively perverse, not perversely perverse. Secondly, this question of pissing around, creative pissing around, and the value of inconsistency, cumulative inconsistency. So that is for sort of smart-ass people from Princeton or somewhere to come along and then post-rationalize as to what it was all adding up to, which is never correct, because they don't get the subtlety of perversity. They don't want to. They want to make their PhD thesis out of it. So, but without more of my hobby horses, you know my hobby horses about, you know, clever intellectuals and the architectural scene getting in the way. But over to the guys, if somebody wants to pick something up here. Any of you. I'm not chairing this, I'm just sort of throwing the odd irritant into the ring.
I think it's chairless. I think what you might do, Peter, is you want to go to that next one? Let me say some words about this. And then what we can do is just move down the line and have each.
But I just wanted to know whether somebody that I've thrown out a couple of hints. Is anybody just this minute who wants to react sort of energetically to that?
I think there's, I think there is something about the value of the mistake, of the unpredictable in the process of the drawing, where there's a very strong feedback system between what you produce and what you're thinking. So much so that what you're producing starts leading what you are thinking. And the drawing becomes the kind of driver of what you're doing. And I think for us in art, at least I think in the I would say generically in the Bartlett culture, the leading system is the production of stuff, of drawings, of models, which were not predicted to some degree. They appear and they emerge and they lead the way. And that means that the mistakes are actually quite interesting because they break the default condition, or the rule that one tries to establish. And I think that's where a lot of the invention comes in, which is when one is trying to do something, but actually something else starts emerging afterwards. And then the projects start getting their own way and not being established as a rule and to kind of follow. And I think a lot of the interest is to do with the construction of images that are not just pure illustrations, but actually constructed drawings. So they're actually very thought through, but they have this unpredictable factor because of the drawings being their own beast. And I would say that we all share that. We all share the enjoyment of that.
I would say Laura and I, when I'm speaking to Laura and I, we are champion this or about it. I think that what interests us are the ideas as much as the product, and somehow tailoring those ideas to match some sort of premise that you might have. And in that way, it is essentially flip between both of these things, so you can juggle a lot of ideas and lots of concepts at the same time. I would also, in response to your drawing question, suggest that drawings are they're quick. They're often very active, so you get some kind of response from them. You can feel them, you can touch them, you can spin them around, you can go to the other side of the room and look at them, you can split it whatever you like. In that sense, there's an immediacy which tolerates a low boredom threshold. Yeah, and I think the image you showed at the very beginning, the Heath Robinson one, I think is key actually across a lot of the people we surround ourselves with. In London, it's fantastically inventive, but they're also very spatial, all of the ideas that Heath Robinson illustrates. And I think what's quite interesting, I know you raised against theorization, but he came up with a lot of those images, rather like that one there. He came up with something called Captain K.G. Brown or something. And, you read the text that goes along with those, and yes, it is racist, it is sexist, and it was done in the 30s, but actually there's some fantastic symmetry between the two, and I think there is some way that they can cross over between each other, but I think that's it.
I think most of the time, what I do and what my students tend to do, we tend to be quite daft about it all. I mean, I think this image here by Heath Robinson sums up my brains half the time. That's a very honest opinion of what I do. I think I wouldn't sit very well as an academic in the American sort of Ivy League universities, because the thing is that I have never successfully written down a hypothesis, aims and ambitions and research outputs and the whole lot, and successfully completed it as intended. That's why I'm a very unsuccessful research bidder. I never get money for my research work because I would start the project somehow as as a chicken. It would end up as a fish. That's a problem. But I think that's part of the fun of this method of working, because it's the fun of discovery, the fear of what the project would turn out to be, the anxiety, the adrenaline drives the project. So in a way, that's what I see research is, rather than it being so staged and almost knowing the outcome. I don't know, maybe other people have other opinions about it, but I find that most exciting.
Being CJ's student, or having been CJ's student, I completely agree that I think it's most exciting.
Pascal can vouch for it, that I'm absolutely daft half the time.
Yes, right. In a very, very good way, though. And half the time throughout my final year, I think I didn't have a clue what I was doing. However, I was enjoying it at all times, and I think part of the excitement was coming from the conversations that actually led to, even within tutorials, you wouldn't know where you start, but you actually somehow had an answer, and for the next tutorial, you'd somehow come up with something else. And it was constantly a question of finding yourself and finding your style of drawing. And actually, every drawing was a project in itself in many ways. And my drawings actually tend to take quite a long time. I put a lot of effort into all my drawings, and I don't know how often I don't know what I'm starting off with, and even within one drawing, my project might change, and I think that's really, really important. So all my drawings are crafted and rather than making say a 3D model and then picking views, I think I construct drawings from A to B, so they're almost like buildings in themselves, I think.
Peter, this conversation probably is not very exciting to our audience, isn't it? Probably they're expecting very intellectual discussion.
We can revert to the prescribed system, which is that we're going to go from, I think, your group, you and Pascal first. There'll be an appropriate. We ought to say something.
Hold on.
Eric wants us to talk about this. I'm not quite sure what we have to say about it. It's a picture of a building by a well-known person. It's not a drawing, but
We'll find out. That's why they're here. I think that there's something either selfish or self-interested about SCI-Arc's invitation to your colleagues, and it has to do with the context of a discussion, which is not only a SCI-Arc discussion, but as I said initially, a more global discussion that has to do with the application of new drawing media, which has led, I think, in my view, to a kind of genre. You want to be a radical architect, this is how you do it. These are the rules, this is the game, these are the tools, this is what it looks like. And I think my point is that it's not so much to attack that pro forma as to attack every pro forma. So this is a long-running problem in the world of production of drawings and ideas. And by the way, I think from the point of view of a school like SCI-Arc, which is extremely interested in the production of drawings pursuant to the production of buildings, that we might make a distinction or not. In other words, when students are listening to somebody who describes himself as daft, or starting in this direction and going in another direction, the framework within which that discussion takes place isn't altogether clear. In other words, is this an introverted side of drawing? And the audience for the drawing is the one you find when you look in a mirror. You're drawing it essentially for yourself and your colleagues, or is it in fact the beginning of a notion that belongs to a conception of a building idea which gives it a much more extroverted aspect? And that distinction, that discussion is probably worth getting into in terms of the work that we have upstairs. The reason, this is from Phillips and Philip Johnson and Hitchcock's The International Style, which a lot of you know, which was published in the late 20s and resulted in a show at the Museum of Modern Art, and in fact did for several generations exactly what we're at SCI-Arc apprehensive about, which is to codify a form language of architecture. And if you look at that book, if you look at the appendix of that book, The International Style, for those of you who don't know it, the whole series of building images, buildings that belong to the 1920s, And there are rules and regulations, so this is good and this is bad. And this is just an example, so Le Corbusier will be glad to know that he misplaced the fly screen on the wall of the building. And if he wanted to be a proper radical architect in the pro forma that Johnson and Hitchcock were outlining, it would go away. And I think part of what our concern is that we want to avoid that. And we want to develop a kind of consciousness that part of this is personal. So if you're daft in an idiosyncratic way. It belongs to you. It doesn't belong to a kind of collective pro forma of drawing. So somewhere in the discussion, I think what would be useful for us and useful for the audience is to go through the group and identify, I think they're one image, Wendy? One image each from each team. If we could do that, and then maybe you want to say a few words about that project which you chose here, then identify your team, and then maybe we'll find a way to wander off again from that.
I guess it's my turn, Peter, isn't it? Why is it always me? I should have said it. Okay. I'm CJ Lim. I'm the, I guess, founder of Studio 8. But before I go into the diatribe about who I am, I really would like to thank Eric and Peter for inviting all of us here this evening to put up a show. We are incredibly honored, and it's very exciting for all of us. And Wendy for putting up with all our demands and tantrums and bad behavior. Thank you very much, Wendy. Okay, back to business. My office is really very much a kind of cottage industry where I have two lives. One is the projects which I call the assemblages, very much dealing with narratives. And then we have the huge mega master planning projects, which is the other one. By the way, that's my new book. I would like to take the opportunity now to plug the book. So if you want to buy a copy, you can buy a copy later on upstairs or down there. And I guess I have these two positions where I find it most interesting to deal with very poetic notions of space making and culture and history, and then tying it into the very large scale projects where one has to work with government agencies like the Chinese government or the Korean government. So that's me. Thank you.
Hi, this is my project. I'm Pascal. As I said, I was one of CJ's students at Bartlett. These are two images of my thesis diploma project, which is called New Monophobia. These are drawings of a portable city, basically. It's a miniature portable city. The final project that you can see images of upstairs was a basic DIY kit of a miniature city that you could build yourself at home, almost like a sort of a Chinese miniature garden or bonsai tree or dollhouse that you could inhabit through your imagination. The idea sort of came from, it was partly based on trying to tackle the recession as much as anything by trying to make projects possible that wouldn't cost the world, that don't need a lot of space, so you could basically put them at home on a desk and you can enjoy them there. And I mean, that's the basic idea of that, and you can see more downstairs. Thank you.
I think Pascal forgot to mention it's fueled by a potato.
Yeah, sorry.
That's how daft the English education for architecture is.
Competitions and projects we've been doing the last 10 years. So some of the drawings upstairs, because somebody just asked this morning, so they're about 10 years old. So it's an ongoing investigation on how a collaboration between two people, both being naive and selfish enough to do PhDs by design, so a lot of research, lots of text about what you want to do, how you perceive about trying to do it, and what actually the results were. and how actually two different ambitions and two understandings and two trajectories actually can become a drive for the establishment of a common vocabulary. So there are obviously different stories, and if you ask him, he would have a completely different story, different propaganda behind what actually it's all about. I would tell you a completely different one. In terms of drawings, I think we both consider them not illustrations but feedback systems. First of all, to convey ideas to ourselves and to communicate them to each other and then, if possible, to a wider audience. So it's quite important. It's not just an illustration of an idea, it's actually a driver towards something else. Yeah.
Actually, I would like to just make a comment, which is a bit of a reaction to Eric's point. I think in our work, one of the things that we are very aware of is the danger of a digital modernism, as we are calling it. At least in the London scene, you get a lot of people that are so fascinated with the new media that there's a really one-liner take on these things. People just do that. And there's actually more and more a kind of international network, people that travel and are in the right places to teach and to talk about this kind of new media obsession. And in fact, there's a certain international style going on. And in a way, we both were writing about this sort of problem of a new modernist attitude, that there are certain dogmas that you have to kind of follow to be in the scene and to be doing the correct thing. And I guess our production is very much a response to, for instance, break with the grey monochrome attitude that exists in this digital modernism that exists in a lot of work, or the necessity of having a certain language that has to emerge. Otherwise, you are kind of out of the scene. And
Could I ask you, I think the digital modernism term is a useful one. Could you say specifically what it is that belongs to that genre? And could you say more specifically, maybe with respect to this item, what it is that you guys are doing which runs counter to that?
Well, maybe the grey whitewash, let's say, the default properties and characteristics that are imposed by digital software, which is mostly grey. Kind of a super-engineered optimization protocol agenda. So kind of a neo-Gothic approach is actually structured, and digital electronics are more important than the creation and the celebration of space at some point. And the third one could be a neo-Sachlichkeit somehow. Again, that actually there's a quite sooner, in my opinion, scientific understanding of rigor and well, Sachlichkeit obviously was from the 20th century. Objectivity, in terms of actually the objective and the way of evaluating and establishing a criteria of quality or value are engineered and are scientific in terms of digital. They are technological. I think that's some of my understanding of modernism. There are obviously wider connotations.
there's a lot of, there's hardly any space for the narrative. There's no space for the atmospheric, for the experiential, and a lot of the work that we see around. And I would say that our pursuit through our drawing is a lot to involve us as the ones that experience the work, rather than having a formula that is based on, for instance, components or some sort of system. These are kind of the words that we're trying to avoid: the system or the surface, or the iterative component that exists. I think that it's about a kind of shift out of that. This will lead to some more conversation.
Hi, I'm Yusef Al-Mehdari. I'm one of Professor Marjan's students, and these two images you're seeing university here began as studies into the human body. I was pretty much trying to define a new type, or to me, a new type of architectural language that I could apply to a building at a much larger scale. Well, I tend to sketch entirely in 3D. So when I draw a line, it's a big gesture. I'd rather not have a limitation or a paper edge or anything. So pen, pencil, and eraser are replaced with copy paste and Control Z. And so it all just kind of develops from basic repetitions such as extrusions and bevels and bridging, connect, splitting. But what I was always trying to evoke was a sense of movement, of exaggerated motion, which, having come back from Rome in the time just before having done this, I was highly influenced by Baroque architecture. And as you can probably see upstairs later on, I use this as a way of generating more form and atmosphere in the other buildings I was working on.
So this is us. So I'm Mark Smout, and this is Laura Allen. Together we are Smout Allen, and we it's rather ridiculous, isn't it? We practice out of Bartlett as well, like everyone else here, and our work is generally concerned with changing climatic conditions or changeable environments, and in some way looking at how they can generate an architecture. This is our previous book was called Augmented Landscape, which looked at how architecture could illuminate the allegedly natural environment. And we did a few projects that examined that, and in particular we looked at one project called the Retreating Village, which looked at the receding coastline of the east of England and how the land was all falling into the sea, and we generated this sort of twitchy, rather technical village that would retract along with the coastline on the east of England coast. This latest piece of work, which is all new, the work upstairs, is called an envirographic architecture, and we are looking at how there can be some symbiotic relationship between architecture and a changing and complex environment, and again looking at how that can be illuminated. It sounds the same as the last project.
Yeah.
It's identical actually. That's not alarming, isn't it? I mean, this project is the first stage in a series of drawings that we're doing, being curated by Jeff Manoff from Building Block for an exhibition in the Nevada Museum of Art, culminating in a large installation. But we're looking at 8 or 9 sites on the UNESCO biosphere. That's Lanzarote, and for those of you who kind of know anything about biospheres, it's about that UNESCO aren't interested in just blocking people out of vast tracts of land. They're interested in how people can live on very complex terrains and within complex natural setups. So this project is called the Current Accumulator, and it looks at oceanic oscillations, all the sort of currents that operate in the oceans around the world, and how they generate a lot of the weather systems that our planet suffers from. So this is just a project with some large solar ponds that look at the notion of solar pond energy production, and these large solar ponds, which are around sort of oculuses or ponds up there, they shift and move around in the landscape, pressing themselves against these bows that take up the sort of the energy of the system, occasionally released, but they suggest this idea of the Earth moving around water rather than the other way around. So all those projects deal with water.
Yeah, I'm just going to say a bit about drawings in relation to this piece of work and in relation to ideas in general for us. And that would be to say that they're sort of placeholders for ideas until the drawing takes on a new form or another drawing is iterated. They're a container for a lot of future speculation about them. And this drawing particularly was done in imperial, 2 inches by 2 inches, and then done at what was that one? Bigger. Just twice. And then we move on, and then there's new work. So it's not something that's really laboured. It waits for another another method or another outcome to test those ideas again, rather than to revisit this drawing again and again and again, explored again and again and again. So it's really is a fast-moving, inventive process.
That would be me. I'm Johan. I studied in Marjan Colletti at Bartlett as well. And I sort of, it's not ironic, but it's kind of funny that this debate has been drawn to drawings and digital modeling, because my last year I hardly did any drawings. I mainly did models. And the drawings were very much secondary, or meaning that some models were made as a two-dimensional illustration. That means that you take a photo and that becomes a new drawing. And the digital media was very much a sort of a secondary thing as well, that was used for me to kind of tool things in 3D as well. So I sketched my way out, and I do agree with the mistake, but I still think that mistake comes from a sort of heavy intuition that is based on your 7 years of education anyway. I think this project was about bringing back ornamentation almost, bringing back the ornament, and in the way that I was dealing with, which is probably a little bit tricky, the Americans' way of almost like yeah, I know it's very, very difficult. But it was dealing with the Federal Hall in New York, which was the first Congress in America, and now it's sort of a national memorial, and the value of things and the way that we use references to build up a sort of an idea of authority. So in a way, I redesigned the Federal Hall in order to bring back its authority, and I use sort of visual references as a way to do that, basically, and connecting spaces visually and stuff like that. But they're all models almost, and they're all sort of handcrafted. Yeah, so that's about it, I think.
I just want to take the opportunity before we go back down the table of filling in a sort of gap, which I think now we've got the potted bios and positions, sub-positions and so on. Filling in between Eric's provocative modernist reference and reference about modernism and consistency in the international styles, and where he said that, and a little tiny bit of history, and it's sort of prompted by, in a funny way, by seeing Jean-Michel Cretas sitting in the front row, who was a student of ours at the other place, where I and he and you studied, which is of course up the street, which is the AH, rather like discussing SCI-Arc culture by suddenly sort of having a hiccup and talking about UCLA, or God help us, even USC. And Eric said if you want to be a radical, there were certain things that you did. And I find myself at the moment, in recent times, listening to somebody like Patrick Schumacher being very, very shrill and very Marxist about parametrics, remembering that the generation, maybe a couple of generations ahead of me, had to build in glass. If you were modern, you did glass. I came in after the glass period, but I'm amazed to see that, of course, if you can't think, you use glass. You see it in every downtown, both in this side of the Atlantic and the other. So it's actually sustained. And maybe, Patrick's kind of parametrics in some weird shape or form may sustain for those who can't think of anything else. I like to throw that in, because I think there is, I sort of share your view that there are certain parallels. And these will inevitably recur every 50 years, 40 years, 30, because there are a whole lot of people who want religion. I really believe there's always people out there who want religion, and us sort of spooky characters are rather, I'm not sure whether we want religion or our threshold of boredom fights the religious thing. But just to fill in on history, modernism never really took hold in the UK. We were very late. You can go to smaller countries, whatever, and find much better modernist stuff. We had a lot of emigre modernists who were on their way to America, and some never got there. But we didn't really have modernism. And we've always been fiddlers. We've always been craft was the sort of thing that appealed, and you fiddle and you do this. And there's another aspect, which was my own teacher, Peter Smithson, one of my teachers, who evoked often the conversation about the artisan tradition, where the young guy looks over the shoulder of the old guy sees how you do it, and then wants to set up his own position, and so deliberately starts to do it differently, more differently, etc. So there's that as well, but modernism never took root, but what sort of hovered around was this crafty thing, and I think that is an essential part of the continuance of the drawing. You know, I even spend time in your school shop looking at Prismacolor pencils and deciding on this one or that one, and perhaps preferring to cut them with a knife than with an electric cutter. I mean, I fall into that terrible trap. What then happened, I have to mention the other place, like sitting here mentioning UCLA, I have to mention the A because I came from there, you came from there, he came from there. We transplanted the A up the road to replace a void. And then we started doing the A better than the A, and then the rest is history. But what happened was that there was this deliberate slight irritation with European modernism, in the same way that the Brits have always had an irritation with the hard lines of Central European philosophers, a bit like the Japanese in that respect. The offshore island that gets pissed off with the consistency of the onshore. And then what happened was that if you analyse the work of people like Cedric Price, for example, who is a great hero of all of us, if you look at his drawings, they at first look highly simplistic. But if you know the work of artists such as John Piper, who was very active in the 1950s, as a sort of scenographic, episodic, almost cartoonist, you see more John Piper in Cedric. There is a selectivity of those funny, apparently throwaway bits of diagram. And it's the episodic quality and the snippet, the architecture of the snippet being more interesting than going right the way through, which is, of course, in a sense, a counterculture to the École des Beaux-Arts tradition, because I still feel that a lot of certainly commercial American architecture is still in love with the École des Beaux-Arts tradition. It still likes to lay things out on axes, and it wasn't just the sort of McKean, Mead and White generation who were sent to the Beaux-Arts to learn it. I see it. You see it in commercial American architecture, but we deliberately went into these byways, and you even see it now. There's recent Bartlett work, which I used in the book a couple of years ago, where it looks as if it's arts and crafts, and every pan tile is drawn. But it was drawn with some extremely quick, sophisticated computer program, looking like arts and crafts. And we were only talking this afternoon to your students about the idea that the bitch computer, the computer that would fight the other computer and deliberately throw it off course. I think that's an instinct. When one transplanted the AA culture to the Bartlett, if I dare say such a thing, there had been a subculture. I was intrigued to see out of the corner of my eye this afternoon one of your teachers, who I remember does these wonderful, wonderful pencil drawings. Coy Howard, who may or may not be here. I was a great admirer of Coy Howard's drawings, and I remember that your chairman here, in another drawing that I used in the book, did a kind of Coy Howard type of rendition of an Eric Moss building. And there's a funny analogy between that and the kinds of shaded pencil episodic stuff that Danibor Vasily's students at the and then later at Cambridge did. There's this sort of spooky thing, which is very, very interesting. It can be worked into the eccentric thing, can be worked into the artisan tradition. I mean, I'm trying to cover a lot of territory in a gulp. Then, as it got to the Bartlett, the strongest thing I think we developed in the first 5 years was actually the development of the workshop. Not but using the workshop like as if you were a drawer in the workshop, so that soldering in a piece of metal or doing a bit of vacuum form had the same wishry as a fine line piece of pencil or a smudge piece of pencil. Though it is technically model drawing something else, in fact, the motivation, the deviant motivation, bored with that, actually is part of the same tradition. Okay, it's still funny stuff, and how do you make working drawings out of it, and how do you sell yourself to a commercial office. And I find that currently, dare I say it, and I'll say what I say privately in my press, that AA students at the moment are more acceptable to commercial offices because they behave nicely and they do what they're told. Bartlett students are more acceptable to slightly individualist offices because they're more inventive. Now, of course, there are many eccentricities. I would like to put that out as a kind of cri de coeur, and I know that Brett, who's a former student of mine anyhow, is going to come through here and sell you the AA in a matter of weeks. Anything that anybody wants to pick up from that?
I wanted to drag it back to the Los Angeles, but no commentary is precluded. One of the intriguing aspects of this discussion, and a lot of people at SCI-Arc have heard the thesis student who stands up and says, "My project is about Rimbaud." All about Rimbaud. They kind of look at the project, and you go to the next project, which is about Baudelaire. And of course, neither project has anything to do with either Rimbaud or Baudelaire. And I think that what seems to be a conceptual philosophical necessity to associate an intellectual or artistic narrative with the production of a drawing is worth talking about, because it seems to me that the difference between this group and a lot of the caricatures, or some of the caricatures that I just mentioned, is that the philosophical notions are very much integrated and very much a substantial part of the production of the drawing. So if you accept the premise that it's about Rimbaud, that resonates in a very particular and personalized version of the idiom or the drawing or the tactic of the drawing or the strategy. And it might be useful to us, or to some of us, to hear a response to both the need to set a sort of intellectual premise or foundation for a project, and then to find that in another language, in a language of production and drawings and models, and in fact to be able to say with a straight face, or not too big a smile anyway, that the one reiterates the other, that the language linguistically and the language as a form language belong to each other, and you're concerned about that, and the drawing substantiates that. And I think you could see that if we went back through these and you could talk a little bit about specifically what the premise, what the conceptual premise is outside the drawing in a way, what humanity, what human premise brings that subject matter to life, is realized in the production of a drawing, as opposed to simply digital modernism qua digital modernism, you're done. So that's certainly a subject here, and if it's a subject for you, I think it would be worth some discussion. Anybody want to pick up on that?
I can say something. I think it's that. I very much agree with what Mark said in the very beginning about sort of an idea, bringing forward a project. I don't think I could. The intellectual value of a project which starts out by sort of researching something is absolutely crucial to push your design further. And I think, no matter what, as Peter said, no matter what kind of vehicle you use to push that idea forward, it is still sort of, it's just a tool to sort of to do it in a way. And this project completely evolved from the research I did, because I was sort of pushed to do something in New York, and it would have looked completely different anywhere else, I think. So that language was sort of brought towards the surface by an inspiration of a place, I think, and a culture. So without that, it wouldn't have looked like that.
I think the inspiration and the energy we mustn't underestimate that, the energy from the culture. I think if you look at the catalog, there's this tiny little image of a project that we first started when we did these assemblage projects called Virtually Venice. It was for the Venice Biennale some years back. And I think that was an approval, child. I think it all came from, for me, each project that we do, especially those ones that deals with culture within the offices and history, is very much constructed as almost as if I'm writing a novel. And that project, Virtually Venice, was very special in the sense that it was a project that we didn't know what to do when we were invited by Peter and British Council to participate in the Biennale. And the thing is that what I wanted was not an old project, a flashy project. I wanted to do a project that was very, very different from all the other superstars that was going to exhibit there. They could afford huge models. They have incredible computers that, I'm sure even DreamWorks will be jealous of. They can churn these things out. They could do the very fashionable parametrics and so forth. And in a way, it was my reaction to do something quite different. Could I have the assemblage page? It was to do a project that was very personal to my culture, not so much this one. Virtually Venice was a kind of analysis between Eastern and Western culture. And Kublai Khan and Marco Polo were the two protagonists of the project, representing East and West. And so that's almost a semi-autobiographical existence. And me using narrative drove the project. And in a way, that's how we discovered this sort of technique of assemblage, how we could actually manipulate the engineering of paper to construct history, to represent culture, to represent me in a way at this event, which was in Venice. And I thought that was the moment when I actually discover how I could actually deal with my own sort of, it was almost therapeutic. It was almost like Woody Allen going to a therapist. It was really cathartic. It was really enlightening. So again, my position is different. But I think I want to bring in something, I think Eric mentioned it, that the value of the drawing to us, because we haven't built that many projects. Hopefully some of the master plans are going to go ahead in China. But the things that the drawing to us is not just a piece of information for construction. To us, it sounds terribly pretentious if I say this, but it is a piece of poetry.
Kind of sharing is something maybe that comes out of our experience now teaching at UCLA for a quarter, which was something that we were discussing quite intensively. And it had to do with, first of all, the short period of time to produce something that is part of the American system. And as we understood, UCLA even has less time than SCI-Arc has. And us being part of a system where we have students that stay with us for 2 years. And also the other thing which has to do with the portfolio culture. And we were actually very surprised of how alien, how difficult it was to explain why the portfolio was so crucial. And it actually made us reconsider how much we use the portfolio sometimes as a crouch to defend certain ideas which probably don't have any value, or sometimes how important it is actually to create this sort of feedback diary that allows quite a lot of side conversations to come into the project. And I mentioned before this idea that we are trying not to do projects that are one-liners, that are about just one idea. And I guess the portfolio is absolutely necessary for this sequence of different possibilities, which are not necessarily tests, but they are They are sometimes dangerous moves, or moves that go completely on the side, but become quite relevant 3 months later, or 6 months later, or actually a year and a half later, that become pretty relevant. And I like to think that people like Yusef, that mentioned the Baroque, that was just one side of the investigation, but the body itself and the expression values was a completely different one. And probably at some point we came together. Then you were discussing polyhydras and hypersurfaces. That was another kind of layer of conversation that just was, by the way, being developed. And then there was a cultural side of things. A project in Malta, what is the hybridity of Malta as a cultural religious condition? Then the choice of the site in the program that is very individual. This takes a long time, actually. And we were struggling when we were teaching here of having to compress this into a very short period of time, of 10 weeks.
But Marcos, the only thing is that I think time is not an issue. I think, it's mindset. It's a total mindset. It doesn't matter if the project is 3 weeks or 3 months to 6 months. I think it's a different cultural mindset of being, as Peter quotes, to quote Peter earlier, being religious to a certain rule or not. And I think it's quite different. I don't want to, maybe this is it becomes a debate about a project, but and I hope both of you will forgive me for this, but I saw a project which is all about agriculture, but there was no understanding of agriculture at all. And the conversation was still very much about form and form making. And so I think there's a big shift between maybe rightly or wrongly the way that we at the Bartlett sort of cultivate a kind of thinking, whereas in certain schools it doesn't have that importance placed in it.
I mean, my response is I like your comment because it shows that we have difference of opinion in Bartlett, which I like to think that is one of our strengths. So if you felt it as a form-making exercise, I would completely disagree, but I think that's helpful because architecture has that. On the other hand, I think...
Sorry, I just want to make it very clear, I wasn't trying to diss your student yesterday at UCLA.
I think the issue of time was something that we were discussing with our colleagues at UCLA and actually when we went out for dinner yesterday. Now, I'm not saying by that it's a better or worse system. It's just I think it's a necessary condition for a lot of the work that we produce with our students at least. And it's somehow, at least in our work with this collaborative work with Marjan, we both end up actually doing this, redrawing or reworking on the same drawings that we did 5 years ago or 10 years ago, on and on. And I think this is part of this it reflects part of this culture that the portfolio and the long time span means that you don't just finish a project and then you to get into the next one. There's a much more continuous system. And I remember Peter was saying, I picked up a drawing from 1996 and I'm redrawing it again. And I remember coming to the bar and thinking, that's somebody picking up a drawing from such a long time ago and actually picking it up again and rethinking it, reinterpreting it.
Mike Webb does it sort of 45 years later, I can't. But I wanted to come onto a sort of generality again of this question of the project, whether it's drawing, model, or whatever. I think I remember a moment at the A many, many years ago when Dalibor Vasily said in a small room, buildings are not important, drawings are much more important than buildings. And I was sort of shocked, even though I was known as a sort of doing the drawings person and hadn't built at that time. But thinking about it more generally, I think certain ideas, let's call them ideas, certain projects, certain ideas have a boiling point. Now when you get tiny doing some buildings, sometimes the building is after the boiling point. The thing reached the point of maximum identification of the idea or maximum quality of the idea, and then it went slightly off the boil because you couldn't afford it or somebody tells you to lower the roof or something. Or it is that sometimes you can even do too many drawings, that they become reiterative. And I think different people have different paces of this. And the marvelous thing of lots of people working creatively in the sort of ways that we've been talking about is that you see different boiling points. And I can understand, I disagree with CJ, that I think for certain sets of ideas, you can't, they're just getting going in 10 weeks. And that you need a later boiling point. That's not to advocate being slow. But where is the most magic point of a project? What I think Marcos is trying to say, that sometimes in a portfolio where there's lots of sketches and extraneous stuff, there was something that actually got nearer to the boiling point than the finished piece that went on the wall and got the rubber stamp on it. And I have found, when interviewing, for example, German students, where they never show you a sketch of anything, they only show you the finished piece, I would get very irritated saying, how did you arrive at that? What was really going on in your head? And they wanted me to sort of criticize the elevation or something. This boiling point thing is a very magic thing, and if there are enough people who are creative around you, you sense different sorts of boiling point. And over a period of a long time, you realize that, again, value systems and points of maximum intensity vary according to the skill, the moment, context, the material, all sorts of curious things. And that, again, coming back to, I think, Eric's frustration, irritation, which I share, is why the everybody does it like this, then you'll be an okay guy stuff is so tedious, because it eliminates the magic of sensing what really mattered to that person. I know that a lot of schools find this position tiresome because it's inherently expensive of time. It's inherently expensive of trying to understand the particular individual. It's inherently multifaceted. There isn't necessarily a formula for Jenny or Jimmy or the bloke, who, as Ron Heron used to say, draws with his foot. You have to sense it and try and hold on to it when the magic is there. It's a difficult process. I think that when we see the exhibition, of course, nobody's sticking up their worst work. They're not actually doing the equivalent of the portfolio with the scruffy thing in the corner that was actually more interesting than the perfect one. So that's also a problem of packaging.
That boiling point sensibility, whatever exactly it is, poetically or personally, the question is whether you can boil it without building it, or that if it's not built, it hasn't yet reached the point that you're referring to. And I think particularly for a group that largely has produced drawings and models, the question has something to do with the destination. It may also have something to do with for whom are you doing this, meaning who's the audience. And it probably has to do with one other thing, which is when are you done? How do you know? And I think those go, who's the audience, when are you finished, at what point does it boil this side of having been constructed? And I think that's the frame of reference for a very important discussion, which we might have to have 5-10 years from now with the same people who might answer very differently. But I think there's an obligation to respond to those questions.
I think in my case, the boiling point tends to be the drawing, not to sing one's own praises. The peak point is the drawing, and then I'll let you know a little incident. We were last year commissioned by the Victoria and Albert Museum in London to do this piece, and the drawings were actually much more interesting than my build piece, I have to confess. And they actually, all the reviews when they wrote it up, they actually said that, the build piece was a disappointment compared to the drawing. And I think that's probably my greatest fear, that the drawing has become the end or the more interesting thing. And when it's built, it becomes less interesting because of the many constraints that the magic of drawing, the trickeries of drawing, the seduction of drawing all models could have. Whereas when you actually maybe build it in a certain way, that's my personal fear.
Hello. How are you here?
Maybe just from a digital point of view, I suppose these are the more user and I, we are the more digitally driven of the whole panel. Somehow the understanding of drawing needs to be slightly more hybrid in the sense that the boundary between drawing and model actually quite blurry. So I suppose the construction of a digital entity in a 3D or 4D space is both a drawing, it's flat on the screen, but actually conveys three-dimensional or four-dimensional qualities that per se transcend this differentiation between the act of drawing the pencil and the act of constructing a model. So, and I'm surely don't believe that this is a crusade about digitality, because otherwise I would probably leave the room right now. I'm a really deep believer in the possibilities of it and in how it can enlarge the vocabulary of architecture. And I suppose that it's not the anti-statement against the modernism, but somehow our ambition to widen the vocabulary and to use it to create another vehicle which is not just before the model or before the building, but actually the build result might be a disappointment to designer. I think I find it very, very scary. And I suppose that the boiling point for me is actually where the drawing becomes poetic in the sense where intuition and expression overlap and create something that is, again, this feedback device for myself as a designer, but also conveys enough information to be described as a drawing. Like, probably it's a coincidence, maybe not. I refuse to look at sketches from students. I take every single idea really seriously, but if they take it seriously, they have to convert it into drawing. So the sketch to me, it's too close to a feedback loop, it's too intimate almost. As an architect, I want a drawing to be, or a cut drawing, a digital drawing, or a model, whatever it is, animation, to be a vehicle that conveys enough information to be original, yes, but also reproducible. I mean, reproduction, and the digital has to do with that, is to me great potential for originality, although it might go against the understanding of it within the art.
I would suggest for us that a drawing becomes successful when it's been iterated enough times to become engaging in some sense. And I think for that reason a lot of our drawings don't end up as drawings. A lot of our work ends up as models that are very tactile, that you can turn, that you can rotate, that you can stick your head in, that clockwork, that somehow work with a diurnal system outside, or they end up just as better sketches than what they started as. And I think that level of engagement is the most necessary part of the drawing, because they're not necessarily for us, but they're for others to become interested in and excited in some way. And I think that, to go back to your first question, I don't have an answer, I can just reiterate it in a slightly different way. I think we're entering this sort of this golden period of ideas at the moment, where the idea is the king. There are so many complex contextual problems in the environment at the moment, which means we might not be here in 50 years or so, that I think we have, sorry, I don't mean to bring doom and gloom into the evening, that aren't necessarily solved by by giving up what we love. I think we can design a future where we can love what we have in some way. We just need to kind of find strategies for designing that decarbonised future in some way. I think that there's a film called Age of Stupid by someone called Franny Armstrong. I don't know if you are aware of the film. And she was asked why there isn't which is a rather gloomy film about climate change, which I won't go into now. But she was asked why there wasn't she's into a film called Age of Enjoyment, or something like that. And she said, because it's very difficult to find positive visions of the future. And I think for anybody studying architecture at the moment, it's a fantastic opportunity where you can just pick and choose so many different contextual problems and turn them into fantastic pieces of architecture design. And I think that's the kind of way we work.
Let me try one more. I want to go back to Peter made a comment a moment ago about Patrick, and parametric Patrick, and who is a colleague and a friend. And what I wanted to suggest is that in the evolution of the process of developing buildings, what's so fascinating is that one could imagine a drawing like CJ's drawing on the wall, turned over to the glass guy who was in Barcelona, and the stone guy who was in Mexico, and the steel fabricator who was in Kansas City. And that in fact the parametric, or what's often referred to as digital projects, which is the current version, in some ways then makes robotically, strangely, makes the drawing come to life, you know, and it's a race. Speaking of robotics, this was a planned interlude. It's getting a little slow. But to try to regurgitate that for 2 seconds, whether in fact the end of the discussion in an imaginative way actually belongs only to this stage of drawing, and that in fact the pieces are then parceled out to other. Thank you. Lots of you. Anybody want to scream a response to that?
Not really. Yeah, we could have some questions from the floor, maybe.
Get a microphone, Chris.
I think everybody, we're discussing the connection between the aids. It binds them in some ways to a set of ideas or non-ideas that are different in each case. It puts you all in front of us today. How is that being engineered, choreographed, and what are your differences then? These are the similarities.
I think the answer is very pathetically simple. Eric asked me to bring some of those Bartlett guys over. I chose the ones I thought were best. It's like going to the greengrocers and saying, you know, the apples are good today. Somebody saying to you, why don't you buy a pineapple? No, it's not a very highfalutin response, but it's true.
I have a question for CJ. Hi, Peter. Hi, CJ. So, CJ, I have a question for you, and it's related specifically to the new work. I saw, when I was in China, your work in Shenzhen, the drawings rather, at the planning meetings. And I wanted to ask you what the difference is between drawings now that you produce in a professional context and the new work that we see here in the library. Is that a fair question?
Yeah, that's a fair question. As I've said, I have 2 lives. The drawings you probably saw in Shenzhen for the Chinese government would be quite different to the very indulgent drawings that you see upstairs, which I call the assemblages. I think for me, drawings there are 2 different types of drawings for 2 different audiences. I think Eric mentioned this audience earlier on, and one is for, I don't mean to patronize the Chinese government, but things that it's very much a set of information to sell a very clear strategy about a huge city. Whereas the assemblages are much more indulgent because there's no client. It's almost like writing poetry for oneself. So that's really quite.
Let me just sharpen the question. Do they inform each other for you? Is there any, because I believe there's some overlap actually.
Yeah, I think I was trying to be simplistic about it. Of course, there's, I don't think we could have done the master plan projects. This sounds very strange. These master plan projects, which is about 9 kilometers square, without actually having done the very indulgent projects that involve narrative and poetry and history and so forth. And I think in a way that trained us up, or trained the entire office up, to think in a very specific way, even dealing with projects that are massive. And I think that's really very important for us.
Anyone else out there? Okay, thank you very much for coming. Thanks for sharing the evening with us, and we'll see you upstairs in 15 minutes.